I was staring at the wreckage of 3 years of work when I heard the clicking sound of heels on my driveway, and I knew exactly who was coming before I even turned around. My name is Quinton Barnes, and I had been keeping honeybees on my 2-acre property in Willow Creek, Oregon for nearly 3 years. What started as a hobby had transformed into something I was genuinely passionate about. I had 4 hives positioned at the back edge of my property, near the wildflower meadow I had cultivated specifically for them. The bees thrived there, pollinating not just my garden but the entire neighborhood. I sold honey at the local farmers market on weekends, and several nearby farms had even asked me to bring my hives over during pollination season. It was peaceful work, methodical, and deeply satisfying in a way my corporate job had never been. But on that Tuesday morning in late April, I came home from an early dentist appointment to find all 4 hives toppled over, frames scattered across the ground, thousands of dead and dying bees covering the grass like a carpet of broken amber. The sight literally made my knees weak. I had stumbled forward, trying to process what I was seeing, when I heard those heels. "Well, I hope you have learned your lesson about keeping dangerous insects in a residential neighborhood," Susan Carmichael said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. I turned slowly to face her. Susan was the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, a position she had held for the past 6 years and wielded like a scepter. She was in her early 50s, with hair dyed an aggressive shade of blonde, and always dressed like she was headed to a business meeting, even though she had not worked outside her home in over a decade. Her hobby was finding violations in the neighborhood and making everyone's life miserable. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I was afraid if I spoke any louder I would start shouting and never stop. "I did what needed to be done," Susan said, crossing her arms. "Those hives were a clear violation of Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA Covenant, which prohibits the keeping of livestock or farm animals on residential properties." "Bees are not livestock," I said, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "I checked the regulations before I started. I went to the county, I got all the proper permits, I made sure I was following every law. County permits are irrelevant. The HOA Covenant supersedes your personal desires," Susan replied. "I sent you 3 warning notices over the past month. I never received any notices," I said. "That is not my problem. The notices were sent to your mailing address on file. Your failure to update your information or check your mail does not constitute an emergency on my part." She examined her manicured nails. "The hives needed to be removed, and since you ignored my warnings, I took action." "You destroyed them yourself?" I asked, looking back at the carnage. "I hired someone to remove the dangerous structures from the property, yes. As is my right as HOA president when a homeowner refuses to comply with covenant violations." I felt something crack inside me. These were not just structures, these were living colonies. Thousands of bees that I had cared for, nurtured, helped survive through winters and disease. The queen bees alone had cost me hundreds of dollars. The equipment was custom built. And beyond the money, these hives represented countless hours of careful work. "Get off my property," I said quietly. "Excuse me, get off my property now." Susan's eyes narrowed. "Do not think this is over, Quinton. You still need to pay the fine for the violation, and you will need to submit a remediation plan to ensure this does not happen again. That information will be in your next official notice." She turned on her heel and walked back down my driveway, got into her white Lexus SUV, and drove away. I stood there for several minutes, just breathing, trying to calm down enough to think clearly. Then I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. I documented everything: the toppled hives, the broken frames, the dead bees, the tire tracks in the soft earth near the hives that clearly showed someone had driven a vehicle right up to them. I took over 100 photos from every conceivable angle. Then I called my friend Marcus, who had introduced me to beekeeping in the first place. He arrived within an hour, took one look at the scene, and let out a low whistle. "This was not an accident," Marcus said, kneeling down to examine one of the destroyed hives. "Someone took a baseball bat or something to these. Look at the way the wood is splintered. And they used something to spray the bees. See that residue?" He pointed to a white foam-like substance on some of the frames. "Susan Carmichael from the HOA said she hired someone to remove them." Marcus stood up, his face dark with anger. Marcus was in his 60s, a retired agricultural inspector who had spent his entire career working with farmers and beekeepers. "Quinton, what she did was not just wrong, it was illegal. These were registered agricultural hives. You have your apiary license with the state, right?" "Of course, I got it the first year." "Then she just destroyed registered agricultural property. In Oregon, that carries serious penalties. The state takes this stuff really seriously because of how important pollinators are to the agricultural industry." "What kind of penalties?" I asked. "Depends on the damage, but we are talking thousands of dollars, potentially. You need to call the Oregon Department of Agriculture, file a report immediately, and you should probably get a lawyer." I spent the rest of that day on the phone, First, I called the Oregon Department of Agriculture and filed a formal complaint. The woman I spoke with, Linda, took extensive notes and told me an inspector would be out within 48 hours. Then I called a lawyer, a guy named Robert Chen, who my brother had used for a property dispute a few years back. Robert listened to my story, asked me to email him all the photos, and told me to send him copies of all my permits and licenses. This is pretty clear-cut, Robert said. She destroyed registered agricultural property without legal authority. Even if there was an HOA violation, which I doubt there was, she would have had to go through proper legal channels. She cannot just destroy someone's property. What do I do next? I asked. Let me do some research. In the meantime, do not communicate with the HOA at all. If they send you anything, forward it to me. Do not sign anything, do not pay any fines, do not attend any meetings. Let me handle this. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about the bees, about the years of work, about Susan's smug face. But more than anger, I felt a growing sense of determination. She had picked the wrong person to mess with. The agricultural inspector showed up Thursday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. Her name was Patricia Okoye, and she spent 3 hours examining my property, taking her own photographs, collecting samples, and reviewing all my documentation. She was thorough and professional, and her face remained neutral throughout the inspection. Mr. Barnes, she said finally, sitting down with me at my patio table with a thick folder of documents. I have reviewed your permits and licenses. Everything is in perfect order. Your apiary registration is current. You have exceeded all the state requirements for hive placement and maintenance, and your records are meticulous. Thank you, I said. What happened here is a serious violation of Oregon agricultural law. Your hives were registered agricultural assets. The destruction of agricultural property without authorization carries mandatory penalties under OR 609125. Based on my assessment, you lost 4 mature colonies, estimated replacement value including the bees, queens, equipment, and lost productivity would be approximately $8,000. I nodded, taking notes. However, Patricia continued, the penalty for destroying registered agricultural property is not based on replacement value. It is a statutory penalty designed to deter this kind of action. The minimum penalty is $3,500 per incident. Given that 4 separate hives were destroyed, this could be considered 4 separate incidents, which would be $14,000. My pen stopped moving. $14,000? That is the minimum. If this goes to a hearing and it is determined that the destruction was willful and malicious, the penalty could be higher. There are also potential criminal charges under agricultural vandalism statutes. What happens now? I asked. I will file my report with the state. The Oregon Department of Agriculture will then issue a notice of violation to the responsible party. In this case, that would be Susan Carmichael, since she has admitted to ordering the destruction. She will have 30 days to pay the penalty or request a hearing. And if she does not pay, then the state can place a lien on her property, garnish wages, or pursue other collection methods. Agricultural penalties are taken very seriously in Oregon. Our entire economy depends on farming and ranching, and the state has very strong protections in place. After Patricia left, I called Robert and updated him. $14,000, he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. That is just the state penalty. We are still going to sue her civilly for the replacement value of your hives, your lost income from honey sales and emotional distress. I am thinking we go for at least $20,000 in the civil suit. I just want my hives replaced, I said. You will get that and more. Trust me on this. People like Susan Carmichael think they can bully their way through life because no one ever stands up to them. It is time someone taught her a lesson. The official notice from the Oregon Department of Agriculture was delivered to Susan's house the following Tuesday. I know this because she was at my door an hour later, her face red with fury. I opened the door but kept the screen door locked between us. What the hell is this? She shouted, waving a document. You reported me to the state? Are you insane? You destroyed my property, I said calmly. There are consequences for that. This says I owe $14,000 for some stupid bees. This is ridiculous. I will fight this. I will get a lawyer. I will make sure you regret this. You probably should get a lawyer, I agreed. And you should know that the state penalty is separate from the civil lawsuit I am filing against you for damages. Her mouth opened and closed a few times. You cannot sue me for doing my job as HOA president. Actually, I can. You exceeded your authority and destroyed registered agricultural property. You are personally liable for that, not the HOA. We will see about that. Susan snapped. She turned and stormed back to her car. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. Susan called an emergency HOA meeting and tried to rally support against me. She sent out an email to all the residents claiming I was keeping dangerous insects that threatened children, and that I was now trying to bankrupt the HOA with frivolous lawsuits. But her plan backfired spectacularly. 12 of my neighbors, including 3 other board members, showed up at the meeting and spoke in my defense. They talked about how they had never had any problems with my bees, how their gardens had flourished since I started keeping them, how I had given several of them jars of honey as gifts. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Dorothy, actually started crying when she talked about how she had loved watching the bees work in her flower garden. "Susan, you have gone too far this time," one of the board members, a man named Harold Preston, said during the meeting. "I was not there, but 3 people recorded it and sent me the video. Quinton is one of the best neighbors we have. He keeps his property immaculate, he follows all the rules, and his bees were not bothering anyone. You took it upon yourself to destroy his property without consulting the rest of the board, and now you are trying to drag the entire HOA into your personal vendetta." "This was not personal," Susan insisted. "This was about enforcing our covenants." "Bees are not livestock," Harold shot back. "I looked it up. The covenant says no livestock or farm animals. Bees do not fit that definition. You decided to interpret it that way because you do not like Quinton. That is not true. Everyone knows it is true, Susan. You have been looking for a reason to go after him ever since he voted against you in the last board election." That was actually true. 2 years ago, the HOA had held elections for board positions, and Susan had wanted to implement a bunch of new rules, including mandatory landscaping services that would have cost each homeowner an extra $300 a year. The landscaping company was owned by her brother-in-law. I had openly opposed it and voted for her opponent. She had won anyway, but barely, and she had held a grudge ever since. The meeting ended with the board voting to formally distance the HOA from Susan's actions and to state on the record that she had acted without board authorization. It was not much, but it was something. Meanwhile, Robert was building our civil case. He had me document everything. My initial investment in the hives, my ongoing expenses, my sales records from the farmers market, testimonials from the local farms that had hired me for pollination services. He also had me get statements from Marcus and 2 other beekeepers who examined the wreckage and confirmed that the destruction was willful and could not have been an accident. "This is a strong case," Robert told me during one of our meetings. "We have everything we need. Property destruction, lost income, even emotional distress, given how much time and care you put into these hives." "When do we file?" I asked. "I am waiting to see how she responds to the state penalty first. If she pays it without fighting, that is basically an admission of guilt, and our civil case becomes even easier. If she fights it, we will wait for that hearing and use that testimony in our case." Susan chose to fight it. She hired a lawyer, a guy named David Roth, who had a reputation for being aggressive but not particularly smart. He filed a response claiming that Susan had acted within her authority as HOA president, that the bees did constitute livestock under a reasonable interpretation of the covenant, and that the state penalty was excessive and punitive. The hearing was scheduled for June 15th, about 6 weeks after the destruction. It would be held at the county courthouse in front of an administrative law judge who specialized in agricultural cases. I spent those 6 weeks rebuilding. Marcus helped me order new hives and bees. I had to go with package bees rather than established colonies, which meant it would be over a year before they were producing at the level my old hives had been. But it felt good to be working with bees again. Even if these were starting from scratch, I also started a blog about the whole situation. I did not use anyone's real names, but I documented everything that had happened, and the post went viral in the beekeeping community. I got messages of support from beekeepers all over the country, and several organizations that advocated for pollinator protection reached out to offer help. One environmental law firm in Portland even offered to file an amicus brief if the case went to court. The day of the hearing arrived. I put on my best suit, met Robert at the courthouse, and we went inside. The hearing room was small and utilitarian, with fluorescent lights and plain white walls. The judge, an older man named Timothy Walsh, sat at the front behind a raised desk. Patricia Okoye was there representing the Oregon Department of Agriculture. Susan sat at the other table with her lawyer David Roth, looking confident and annoyed at the same time. Judge Walsh called the hearing to order and asked Patricia to present the state's case first. Patricia was brilliant. She methodically went through all the evidence: my permits, my licenses, the inspection reports, the photographs of the destruction, her analysis of the damage. She explained Oregon's agricultural protection laws and why they existed, citing several previous cases where similar penalties had been upheld. She brought in the samples she had collected and explained how the chemical residue on the frames indicated that whoever destroyed the hives had used a pesticide spray to kill the bees before toppling the structures. "This was not a simple removal," Patricia said. "This was deliberate destruction intended to kill the bees and destroy Mr. Barnes's agricultural operation." Then it was David Roth's turn. He stood up and immediately went on the attack. "Your Honor, this entire proceeding is absurd. Ms. Carmichael is the president of a homeowners association, and she was simply doing her job by enforcing the community covenants. Mr. Barnes was keeping bees, which are insects, in a residential neighborhood where children play and people have allergies. The HOA covenant clearly prohibits livestock and farm animals, and bees used for commercial honey production absolutely fall under that definition. Does the covenant specifically mention bees? Judge Walsh asked. Well, no, but does it specifically mention insects? No, but the intent of the provision is clearly to prevent agricultural activities in a residential area. Mr. Roth, Judge Walsh said, I have read the covenant. It prohibits livestock and farm animals. It gives specific examples: cattle, horses, pigs, goats, sheep, and chickens. Bees are not listed. The list is illustrative, not exhaustive, David argued. Perhaps, but even if we accept your interpretation, Ms. Carmichael still lacked the legal authority to destroy Mr. Barnes's property. At most, she could have sought an injunction through the civil courts to have the hives removed. She could not simply hire someone to destroy them. She sent warning notices. Mr. Barnes claims he never received those notices. Do you have proof of delivery? David shuffled through his papers. We sent them via regular mail to the address on file, so no proof of delivery, no certified mail, no return receipt. That is not required under the HOA bylaws. It may not be required under your bylaws, but we are not here to litigate HOA procedures. We are here because Ms. Carmichael destroyed registered agricultural property without legal authorization. That is a violation of state law, regardless of any HOA dispute. The hearing continued for another 2 hours. I was called to testify, and I explained my background with beekeeping, showed my records, talked about how careful I had been to follow all the rules. David Roth tried to make me look irresponsible, asking about bee stings and whether anyone had complained. But I had documentation showing that in 3 years there had been exactly 0 complaints about my bees to anyone. Not the HOA, not the county, not the police. Then Susan was called to testify. That was when things got really interesting. Mrs. Carmichael, Patricia began, did you personally inspect Mr. Barnes's beehives before deciding to have them removed? I did not need to inspect them. I could see them from the street, could you? Mr. Barnes's property is 2 acres, and the hives were positioned at the back of the property, approximately 300 feet from the street. How did you see them? Susan's face flushed. I walked onto his property to inspect them. Did you have Mr. Barnes's permission to enter his property? I do not need permission. As HOA president, I have the right to inspect properties for covenant violations. Actually, Patricia said, I have reviewed your HOA bylaws. They state that inspections must be scheduled with the homeowner and conducted during reasonable hours with proper notice. Did you provide Mr. Barnes notice of your inspection? This is not relevant, David interjected. It speaks to Ms. Carmichael's pattern of exceeding her authority, Patricia replied. Your Honor, Ms. Carmichael has demonstrated a clear disregard for proper procedures and legal authority. Judge Walsh nodded. I will allow the line of questioning. Ms. Carmichael, please answer. I may have walked onto his property without formal notice, Susan admitted. But I had good reason. I had received complaints. From whom? Patricia asked. I do not have to reveal that. Complaints can be made anonymously. How many complaints did you receive? Susan hesitated. 2 or 3. Do you have documentation of these complaints? They were verbal complaints, so no documentation, no emails, no letters, no formal complaints filed. Just verbal complaints that may or may not have actually occurred. I resent that implication, Susan said, her voice rising. I would not lie about something like that. Patricia pulled out a document. Your Honor, this is a petition signed by 18 residents of Willow Creek Estates stating that they had no problem with Mr. Barnes's bees and that they were not aware of any complaints prior to Ms. Carmichael's actions. Several of these residents are members of the HOA board. David stood up. Your Honor, this is turning into a character assassination. Ms. Carmichael's credibility is not on trial here, actually. Judge Walsh said. It is, Miss. Carmichael's justification for her actions is directly relevant to this proceeding. If she acted based on false or exaggerated complaints, that speaks to whether her actions were reasonable or willful. Please continue, Ms. Okoye. Patricia spent another 30 minutes systematically dismantling Susan's justifications. By the end of it, Susan was visibly angry, her face red, her answers short and clipped. Finally, Judge Walsh called for closing statements. Patricia went first, reiterating the facts and the law, and asking for the full $14,000 penalty. David argued that the penalty was excessive and that Susan had acted in good faith. Then Judge Walsh took a recess to review the evidence and make his decision. We waited in the hallway for an hour. Robert was confident. That went well. Walsh was clearly on our side. Do you think he will award the full penalty? I asked. I would be shocked if he did not. When we were called back in, Judge Walsh had a written decision in front of him. He put on his reading glasses and began. I have reviewed all the evidence and testimony presented today. This is a straightforward case. Mr. Barnes operated a legal, properly permitted apiary on his property. He followed all state regulations and maintained meticulous records. Ms. Carmichael, acting as HOA president, decided unilaterally that the Beehives violated the HOA covenant, a determination that is questionable at best. Rather than pursuing proper legal channels to address this alleged violation, she hired an individual to destroy the hives, resulting in the death of thousands of bees and the destruction of valuable agricultural property. Susan's lawyer started to stand, but Judge Walsh held up his hand. Ms. Carmichael's actions were willful, unauthorized, and in clear violation of Oregon agricultural protection statutes. The evidence shows that she acted without board approval, without providing verifiable notice to Mr. Barnes, and without seeking proper legal remedies. Her claims of complaints and safety concerns are not supported by any documentation and are contradicted by statements from numerous other residents. Judge Walsh looked directly at Susan. Ms. Carmichael, your actions have caused significant harm to Mr. Barnes and to the agricultural community. Beekeepers like Mr. Barnes provide an essential service to our state's agricultural industry. Pollinators are critical to our economy and our environment. The penalties in place for destroying agricultural property exist precisely to prevent the kind of arbitrary and destructive behavior you engaged in. He looked down at his decision. I am, therefore, upholding the Oregon Department of Agriculture's penalty assessment in full. Ms. Carmichael, you are ordered to pay $14,000 in statutory penalties within 30 days. Additionally, I am ordering you to pay Mr. Barnes's costs and fees associated with this hearing, which I calculate to be an additional $2,300. Susan's mouth fell open. David immediately stood. Your Honor, my client wishes to appeal this decision. That is her right. However, the penalty must be paid within 30 days regardless of any appeal, unless she posts a bond for the full amount. We left the courthouse in something of a daze, $14,000 plus costs and fees, and we still had the civil lawsuit pending. That was better than I expected, Robert said as we stood in the parking lot. Walsh could have gone easier on her, but he clearly did not like her attitude. Did you see her face when he called her actions arbitrary and destructive? What happens now? I asked. Now she has to pay. If she does not, the state will put a lien on her house. And next month we file our civil suit for your actual damages and lost income. Over the next few weeks, the story spread through Willow Creek Estates like wildfire. Everyone knew about the hearing, about the penalty, about Susan's humiliation. Several people stopped me at the grocery store or the gas station to congratulate me or tell me they had always thought Susan was too power-hungry. The HOA board called another emergency meeting and voted unanimously to ask Susan to resign as president. She refused, claiming they were all conspiring against her, but it did not matter. At the next regular meeting, the board held a vote of no confidence, and Susan was removed from her position. Harold Preston became the interim president. One of his first acts was to officially amend the HOA covenant to explicitly state that beekeeping was permitted on properties larger than 1 acre, as long as the hives were positioned at least 100 feet from neighboring property lines. He also issued a formal apology to me on behalf of the HOA. Susan paid the penalty 2 days before the deadline. I know because I got a notification from the Department of Agriculture confirming that the payment had been received and the case was closed. She did not appeal. A week after that, Robert filed our civil lawsuit in county court. We asked for $8,000 in property damage to replace the hives and equipment, $4,000 in lost income based on my sales records and the pollination contracts I had lost, and $3,000 in emotional distress. Total, $15,000. Susan's lawyer sent us a settlement offer 2 weeks later. $5,000 and no admission of wrongdoing. Tell him to go to hell, I told Robert. With pleasure, he replied. We went to court in September. It was a bench trial, just a judge, no jury. We presented all our evidence. The receipts for the new hives and equipment, my sales records, statements from the farms that had hired me for pollination services, even testimony from Marcus about the emotional investment involved in beekeeping. Susan's defense was essentially that she had already been punished enough with the state penalty, and that I was trying to double dip. Her lawyer argued that I had not actually lost any income because I could start over with new hives, ignoring the fact that it would take years to get back to where I had been. The judge was not impressed. He awarded us $12,000, the full $8,000 in property damage, $3,000 in lost income, and $1,000 in emotional distress. He denied the full amount on lost income only because I had not lost any contracts permanently, just delayed them. With the state penalty, Susan ended up paying $26,000 total plus legal fees. I later heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had to take out a second mortgage on her house to cover it all. But the story was not quite over. In October, about 6 months after the original destruction, I got a call from Patricia Okoye at the Department of Agriculture. "Mr. Barnes, I wanted to let you know that we have completed a full investigation into the destruction of your hives, including interviewing the individual Ms. Carmichael hired to do the actual work." "Okay," I said, not sure where this was going. The individual, a man named Trevor Hodges, stated that Ms. Carmichael specifically instructed him to use pesticide to kill the bees before removing the hives. She told him the bees were dangerous and aggressive, which was false. Mr. Hodges used a pesticide called 7, which is highly toxic to bees. The use of that pesticide on a registered apiary is a criminal offense under Oregon law. My heart started beating faster. Criminal? Yes. We are referring the case to the district attorney's office for potential prosecution. I wanted to give you a heads up because you may be called as a witness. What kind of criminal charge? I asked. Most likely criminal mischief in the first degree, given the value of the property destroyed and unlawful use of pesticides. Both are misdemeanors, but they carry potential jail time and additional fines. I thanked Patricia and hung up. I was not sure how I felt about Susan potentially facing criminal charges. Part of me felt she deserved it, but part of me just wanted to move on with my life. The decision was not mine to make. The district attorney's office filed charges in November. Susan was arraigned in early December. She pled not guilty and demanded a trial. The trial was scheduled for February, but it never happened. In January, Susan's lawyer reached out to the DA with a plea deal. Susan would plead guilty to criminal mischief, pay a $5,000 fine, and perform 200 hours of community service. In exchange, the pesticide charge would be dropped. The DA agreed, with one condition. The community service had to be performed at a local environmental nonprofit that worked on pollinator conservation. Susan would spend 200 hours learning about and helping to protect the very insects she had so carelessly destroyed. Susan accepted the deal. She appeared in court in late January, pled guilty, and was sentenced. I was there sitting in the gallery. She never looked at me, not once. After it was over, Robert and I stood outside the courthouse in the cold drizzle that passes for winter in Oregon. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Honestly? Relieved. I just want to move on. You should be proud. You stood up to a bully, you followed the proper channels, and you won. Not many people would have done that." "I just wanted my bees back," I said. "Well, you got that, and you made sure she cannot do this to anyone else." He was right about that. The HOA had new rules in place. Susan was no longer in power, and she had learned a very expensive lesson about exceeding her authority. I went home that evening to check on my new hives. They were doing well, building up nicely as spring approached. They were not the same as my original colonies, but they were mine and they were thriving. A few weeks later, I saw Susan at the grocery store. We passed each other in the produce section. She looked at me, opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then closed it and walked away. I noticed she looked tired, older somehow. The smugness that had always defined her was gone. I found myself wondering if she had learned anything from all this, if she understood why what she did was wrong. But I realized I did not really care. She was no longer my problem. In March, I got a letter in the mail from the Oregon Beekeepers Association. They had heard about my case and wanted to give me an award for advocacy on behalf of the beekeeping community. There would be a ceremony at their annual conference in Salem. I drove up for the conference on a sunny Saturday morning. The association president, a woman named Karren, who had been keeping bees for 40 years, gave a speech about the importance of standing up for our rights as beekeepers and agricultural producers. "Quinton's case has already had ripple effects across the state," she said. "We have heard from multiple beekeepers who were being harassed by HOAs or local officials, and they were able to point to Quinton's case as precedent. The $14,000 penalty has made people think twice before threatening beekeepers." After the ceremony, dozens of beekeepers came up to shake my hand and share their own stories. Some had faced similar situations. Others just wanted to thank me for fighting back. I met a woman named Jennifer Jacobson who kept bees in Eugene and had been battling her HOA for 2 years. They were threatening to fine her for every day her hives remained on her property. "After your case, I sent them a letter citing the Oregon agricultural statutes and the Carmichael decision," Jennifer said. "They backed off immediately. They did not want to risk a $14,000 penalty. That felt good. Maybe Susan's harassment and my fight back had actually accomplished something beyond just my own situation." Spring turned into summer. My new hives flourished. By July, they were producing honey, not as much as my mature hives would have, but enough to return to the farmer's market. People remembered me and welcomed me back. Several asked about what had happened, and I gave them the short version. In August, I was contacted by a producer from a podcast that covered HOA horror stories. They wanted to interview me about my experience. I agreed, figuring it might help other people in similar situations. The episode aired in September and got over 100,000 downloads. I received emails from people all over the country dealing with unreasonable HOAs, thanking me for sharing my story. One email stood out. It was from a lawyer in Texas who specialized in agricultural law. He told me about a similar case in his state where a rancher had been harassed by an HOA over his cattle. The lawyer had cited my case in his arguments, and the judge had ruled in favor of the rancher, awarding even higher penalties than in my situation. Your willingness to fight set a precedent that is helping people across the country, he wrote. Thank you for not backing down. By the time autumn arrived again, nearly a year and a half after Susan had destroyed my hives, life had returned to a peaceful routine. I worked my day job, tended my bees on evenings and weekends, sold honey at the farmer's market, and enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of watching my colonies thrive. Susan moved away in October. I heard she and her husband sold their house and relocated to Arizona. Some people said it was because of the legal troubles. Others said it was because she could not stand living in the neighborhood after everything that had happened. I did not know which was true, and I did not particularly care. Harold Preston remained as HOA president and did an excellent job. He focused on actual community improvement rather than finding violations to punish. The neighborhood became a friendlier, more relaxed place. In November, I was contacted by a local high school. Their agriculture teacher wanted to know if I would be willing to give a presentation to her class about beekeeping and also about standing up for your rights as an agricultural producer. I agreed and spent an afternoon talking to 30 teenagers about bees, honey, pollination, and what had happened with Susan. At the end of the presentation, a girl raised her hand. Were you scared when you decided to fight back? She asked. Yes, I admitted. I was scared I would lose. Scared I would waste money on lawyers. Scared people would think I was making too big a deal out of some bees. But I was more scared of letting her get away with it. Because if she could do it to me and face no consequences, she would do it to someone else. Do you think it was worth it? Another student asked. Absolutely. Not just because I won, but because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes you have to stand up for what matters, even when it is hard, even when you are scared. After the presentation, the teacher thanked me and told me that several students had been inspired to pursue agriculture or environmental science careers. That meant more to me than any of the awards or recognition. As the year came to a close, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. What had started as a simple hobby, keeping a few beehives in my backyard, had turned into a legal battle, a criminal case, and eventually a kind of activism I never expected or sought out. But through it all, I had learned something important about myself. I learned that I was willing to fight for what I believed in, that I could stand up to bullies and navigate complex legal systems, and that sometimes standing your ground made a difference not just for you but for others facing similar struggles. My hives continued to grow. By the following spring, they were producing at full capacity again. I added 2 more hives, bringing my total to 6. I formed partnerships with 3 additional farms for pollination services. My honey won a blue ribbon at the county fair. Life was good. The bees were thriving. And Susan Carmichael was someone else's problem now, living in Arizona, hopefully having learned that you cannot just destroy other people's property because you do not like what they are doing. On warm spring evenings, I would sit on my back patio with a beer and watch the bees returning to their hives, heavy with pollen, dancing their intricate patterns to communicate with their sisters. The sound of tens of thousands of wings created a peaceful hum that never got old. Marcus came by one evening and sat with me, watching the hives. You ever regret getting into this? He asked, gesturing at the bees. Not for a second, I said. Even with everything that happened with Susan, I would do it all again. You did good, Quinton. You stood up for beekeepers everywhere. You made it harder for people like Susan to push around folks who are just trying to make the world a little better, one hive at a time. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking our beers and watching the bees work. You know what the funny thing is, I said eventually. Susan probably thought she was protecting the neighborhood from dangerous insects. She probably genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. That is what makes people like her so dangerous, Marcus replied. They are so convinced they are right that they do not stop to think about whether they have the authority or the knowledge to do what they are doing. They just act, and other people suffer the consequences. Well, at least she paid for it, I said. $14,000 from the state, $12,000 in the civil suit, $5,000 in criminal fines, plus all her legal fees. I heard the total cost her somewhere north of $40,000. I winced. That is a lot of money. It is a lot of money to learn not to destroy other people's property, Marcus agreed. But maybe she needed an expensive lesson. As darkness fell and the last of the forager bees returned home for the night, I closed up the hives for the evening and went inside. Tomorrow I would check the frames, maybe harvest some honey, continue the endless cycle of care and maintenance that beekeeping required. But tonight, I was just grateful. Grateful for the bees, grateful for friends like Marcus, grateful that I lived in a state with strong agricultural protections, and grateful that I had found the courage to stand up for myself when it mattered. The hives Susan destroyed were gone, but they had been replaced and surpassed. The money she paid had covered my losses and then some. The legal precedent would help protect other beekeepers for years to come. In the end, Susan Carmichael had set out to destroy my beehives and instead had helped strengthen protections for beekeepers across Oregon and beyond. There was a certain poetic justice in that. I fell asleep that night to the faint sound of the bees settling in for the evening, a gentle hum that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new rewards, but tonight everything was exactly as it should be. The bees were safe, the hives were thriving, and justice had been served with a $14,000 agricultural penalty that would make anyone think twice before threatening a beekeeper again.